I use libraries mostly, but when I really, really love a book, I will buy it. And I think I started collecting books when I moved to Montreal, and there were a few books that I took out from my high school library, and I knew I couldn't take them with me, and so I said I gotta invest. And I guess that's how it started. I came with like 4 or 5 books, and now I have quite a few more. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, like, they used to ask us, because we did Concordia together at a point, but like, what is art? And it's a question that you're not really supposed to have an answer to. But the books in my collection that I consider Jewish are by Jewish authors that are either culturally or religiously Jewish. And I think most of my Jewish books, or at least half of them, are in Yiddish or Hebrew. The books that I own that are about Jewish heritage and culture, I think mostly lean towards like mysticism or women's role in Judaism. Like I have one that discusses women's behavior around graves and the responsibility of women for ancestors. That's what I'm looking at. And I used to work with graves, like Jewish graves, so I love that. I also have the Jewish wardrobe from the Israel Museum. It's a really, really big book, and it shows every kind of different Jewish cultures, like dress, basically. And that's one I definitely look at a lot. But yeah, I also have folk tales, Jewish folk tales, which are a big interest for me also. But those are a few examples. I think it's, well, for me, chiefly language is, a really big thing, because especially with Yiddish poetry or Yiddish writing, which I brought a Yiddish book in translation that I will read a little bit from. But the romanticism of Yiddish poetry is something that I've never seen before anywhere else. And the writing is so beautiful, and Hebrew poetry, which I also brought, is so hard to translate into English, and so few people, I shouldn't say that, but often the poems I want to read with the English next to it aren't translated, as hers aren't. But I think the language is something that's really difficult to replicate and can often be forgotten, since we're forgetting a lot of languages. I learn Yiddish from reading because I read with my grandmother every Shabbat, every Saturday, but and also sing in Yiddish, which is a lot easier to learn more phrases and words faster. But Hebrew, I lived in Israel for a year, and they tried to teach it to me when I was a kid, but it didn't stick. Well, I think a lot of my books do. The one that comes to mind is The Imposter Bride, and it's about a woman who comes from the old country and moves to Montreal, actually, and just kind of the story that you hear, but it's very personal. It's really her take, and it's beautifully written also. This one, my grandmother gave it to me. It's Found Treasures, Stories by Yiddish Women Writers. It has some of my favorite writers in it. Who do we have? That's my grandmother. Oh. Goldie Sigal. She moved from Montreal. Like, she's lived in Montreal her whole life, but she just moved, so I received many of her books. And she knows that I love especially women Yiddish poets. And there's a lot of poets that wrote short stories that I didn't know they had. But this one, I actually am not familiar with the author, but I found every single story in this book fully made me cry. The Yiddish poets, they know where to hit you. But she says in this one, she's also a woman from the old country who made Aliyah, who moved to Israel. And basically she feels cut off from her past and her family. And she says, I'm a felled tree, the roots have remained, but my oldest branch has been severed from me. Books are so important, Jewish books, because, as I said, language, you might not be able to talk to, for example, your children about what you've seen. And if you do, it's maybe once or twice. And maybe you don't have the words, literally or metaphorically. So this isn't the book, but this was my ex's favorite poet. And I think probably the first modern-ish book of Hebrew poetry that was ever read to me, or at least the poet was. And it says her name, Yonawanach, and then Shira, so poetry. But I won't read from it because reading in Hebrew is difficult for me. My ex gave it to me. Well, no, sorry, didn't give it to me. But read me this poetry, and my Israeli aunt tracked it down for me. I think it's the second most essential thing to preserving community. They're doing a great job of kind of like igniting community. But the first most important thing is actually getting people together. The second is probably, in my opinion, books. Because, I mean, even you're doing research, and I'm sure you've looked at books to do your research. I trust you will in the future when you become a librarian. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a language that is spoken in books, and especially for people who aren't completely entrenched in the Jewish community, as I'm not. Books definitely help you understand things. Like, even I brought Hebrew poetry. I can't understand every word, but it's very much like the human soul in that way, because you can't really understand yourself completely, but you can understand a lot. So I think it's extremely important that we have Jewish books, and they're very important to the culture and the community.